So I'm going to talk about virtual social interaction and its application in health and healthcare, because that's basically the kind of theme I've been working towards in the past almost 20 years. But before going into virtual social interaction, I was thinking, I think we probably should go back to this concept of real social interaction and what it really means, right? Because I think the concept, how everybody think about it have probably changed quite a bit in the past few years. So in order to answer a question, obviously I went to Google. But I did try ChatGPT, but I didn't like the answer, so I'm gonna stick to the answers I got from Google Image. So when I put real social interaction, these are the pictures that Google Image popped up with. And I think we all kind of agree some of it are definitely real social interactions, right? The ones that we are in a shared space and we're kind of paying attention either to each other or to an object of common interest. This object can be some kind of board game or maybe a sports we're running together, right? But there are also type of interactions that some people think is real, some people is less real. For instance, here I think this group of people are actually playing a video game together. I mean, is that real social interaction, or you're kind of more engaging with whatever is going on the TV screen, right? So I think this is something that's debatable. And I think there are things definitely don't count as real social interaction, are probably like this image here, where this daughter is very upset with his father, who is obviously not engaging with her in real life. And also what we often see on a sort of platform, people waiting for the train, but instead of trying to socially engage with each other, they're just all focusing on their phone. And no matter what you agree with which one's a real social interaction, I think we agree that this is not real social interaction. It's actually quite the opposite. So this actually happened during the pandemic when I was giving a talk online to a group of researchers in Israel. And they sent this picture afterwards as a thank you. And I think they're just trying to brag, because at the time that London was still under lockdown, and Israel, they did some, the government was more proactive, so they were already out of lockdown. So they were able to actually engage with each other in real life. But also they were just bragging about how many VR headsets they have, right? So it's quite a surreal picture. But I think that my point is that I want to kind of start my talk by actually, instead of getting too distracted, dive into sort of virtual social interaction. I want to remind everybody, real social interaction is actually something we're more familiar with as human races. We have evolved millions of years interacting with each other in the real world, right? And this kind of virtual social interaction, no matter which format we're talking about, is only something quite recent. Even you're talking about telephone communication, only probably existed for decades. So I'm gonna actually now get everybody to do a bit of activity. Sorry about the ones online, but I'm gonna actually focus on people in this room. So if we can all have our hand like this, okay? So as soon as you see the next picture, I want you to all open your hand just like what you see, okay? So I'm gonna ask you to close, and then, yeah, okay. So now I'm gonna ask you to do this again, but I ask you to open your hand as soon as you see the next image, okay? Still open your hand, yeah? Okay, you can still do it, but you're only able to do it a little slower. And don't worry, this is very normal. That's exactly how everybody does it. So this is something called imitation, automatic imitation. That's something we can't help, but we all do. And it's not only kind of in the beginning. Even if you do it repetitively hundreds of times, you still have a bit of that, right? So basically, the first one I tried was a congruent condition. The second one was an incongruent condition, right? And then they has been, tested many times that we tend to be able to react towards the congruent one a little quicker comparing to the incongruent one, right? And this difference is called the mimicry effect. And it has been discovered by Hayes back in 2004, and it has been tested many times. And this is basically something that happens in the real social interaction that we probably don't even consciously think about. And has been very neatly summarized by Bach and Chatrand as the unbearable automaticity of being. So we will have the tendency to copy each other. We automatically do that in our social interaction. And it makes sense because we all evolve, over millions of years to be very efficient in understanding and negotiating with each other, and by automatically copying each other's action and mannerism in a conversation, we're actually actively taking our conversation partner's perspective, right? And oftentimes this will lead to better communication. But why it is important to understand it, other than the fact that, in order to create virtual social interaction, we need to really understand what's going on in real social interaction. But also, this on its own has implications in real social interaction. For instance, for people with autism, they might have a slightly different sort of brain mechanism behind how they copy each other, right? So this is a theory that's proposed by Antonia Hamilton, who I had the privilege to work with about 10 years ago. So he proposed a theory in 2008. So he explained mimicry, as I explained, is the implicit and automatic copying of detailed kinematic features of an observed action rather than just the action goal, right? So that's what we automatically do. But we also do something else. We also have emulation, which is where we copy the explicit goal of an observed action. So as human beings, we'll kind of try to do two things at the same time. And I have a clicker here. Sorry about the ones from online. You might not be able to see it, but hopefully I can use this clicker. It's the other way, to see. So basically, for everybody, we have two pathways from the visual input, what we see. We have the automatic imitation. Our sort of motor part of the brain will want to automatically copy everything we see, right? But we have another pathway, which is this one, which is emulation. We try to interpret the goal from the visual inputs, and then we do a bit of planning, and then we decide what we do, right? So the theory is that these two things happen so at the same time. As we can imagine, if I'm having a meeting and I see someone grab a glass of water and have a drink, I might automatically do that. And then so actually, I might reach out my hand already and then thinking, actually, it's good to have a sip of water because I want to keep myself hydrated, right? So in this case, the lower pathway and the upper pathway kind of arrive to the same conclusion that I need to drink some water. But if I'm at a conference and someone grabbed a can of Coke, I may actually reach out my hand to grab it, and then halfway I stop. Actually, I want to stay healthy, so I don't want to drink that can of Coke, right? So in that case, I had a mimicry reaction, but then I did this part and suppressed my mimicry reaction, so I stopped halfway, right? So that's kind of a neurotypical action, right? So the theory of why this could be helping for autism is that it might explain people with autism, they might have still exactly the same as everybody else, this pathway, but their mimicry pathway might not be as strong as everybody else, right? So in order to test that, we actually did an experimental study where we got it's just a psychology student, and we get her to put a Perhemus tracker on her finger, and she also has a tracker on her head, and these are 6 degree of freedom trackers. So just with these 2 trackers, we can actually do inverse kinematic, and then reconstruct the animation of someone doing movements like that, right? So in this case, we got her to basically, we had 4 kind of dots in front of her, and we tell her the sequence, say, now you do 1, 2, 3, or you do 1, 2, 4, or you do 2, 3, 4, right? So we give her a bunch of things for her to do. But then we also told her to do these movements in 2 ways. In one way, she does it with a low trajectory, so she does 1, 2, 3. In another one, she does it intentionally with a high trajectory, 1, 2, 3. Okay, so we recorded everything and then we put that as animation files on the virtual character. We also randomized the order, so each participant would have a different order. And then we have the participant come in and they go through these kind of movement many times, but we also had both neurotypical and participants with ASD as well. So our hypothesis is that everybody would have the tendency to copy the virtual character without realizing they're doing so, but we'll see this copying behavior more obvious in the neurotypical participant, okay? And that's exactly what we found. So NT is neurotypical, and the white bar here is when they see the avatar doing the high trajectory movement, right? And that's the y-axis is the peak height. So when they have the high trajectory avatar, out of the trials, everything was randomized, we do see their average peak being higher as well, comparing to the gray bar, which is lower, right? So it's the same for neurotypical and ASD, but as you can see, the difference is much bigger with neurotypical, right? So that kind of support the theory which I presented earlier. So basically, we found in both groups there is evidence for mimicry, but ASD mimicked less. And we actually had another condition, because we think that if the audience effect, like the person actually paying attention to you, would have a social facilitation effect, would actually amplify the mimicry result. So we actually also programmed the avatar to either say, hey, I'm going to be looking at you when you're doing the task, or I'm going to be looking away while you're doing the task. However, with this, so our idea is that when she's looking at you, this mimicry effect will be bigger compared to when she's looking away. But that's not what we found. So we found, well, not statistically significant, but we found something slightly different, the opposite. So actually, when the avatar is disengaged, the difference between high and low on the y-axis is slightly higher for each group, right? But it's not significant, so it's probably just by chance, right? So this is very interesting. We think there could be two reasons. One could be that we didn't actually conduct a study inside virtual reality, so it doesn't feel as immersive. And the second one is that we think because we just programmed the avatar say, hi, I'm looking at you, and then she just turns her head, because the participant will be wearing a head tracker as well, so she knows where you are, she kind of turns her head slightly. But she wasn't actually programmed to react towards you, see what I mean? So if you made a mistake, or if you do it correctly, her face stays exactly the same, which is probably kind of creepy. And that's probably, when she's looking away, it's actually maybe felt more real, because she's not paying attention to you, therefore she's not reacting to you. So maybe actually when she's looking away, people felt more engaged with her in that sense. So that's our explanation. But that's really interesting. But we thought it also could because it's not because it was not done in virtual reality, and I think now is the point. Actually, go back to the kind of where I started, which is basically my research is predominantly inside virtual reality, and this is the kind of setup we normally run our experiment with. But before explaining what virtual reality is, I'm gonna ask you first. You all tried virtual reality, right? The kind of six-off headset. Anyone haven't tried it? Okay, brilliant. But still, I'm going to explain the technology a little bit, because I think that's still relevant for us to understand a bit more the psychological impact. So which one do you think these two is longer? Okay, you're all clever. It was probably because you saw me doing it in the previous talk or something. So I'm going to play the video. So this is a home recorded video. And I was doing my maternity leave. I have lots of kind of IKEA train track populated around me because I have nothing else better to do. And I discovered this really mind-blowing thing for me at the time. Right, so they're exactly the same pieces from the same train track. So despite knowing really well they're exactly the same size, we can't stop thinking that the one on the left is slightly longer. Hopefully that's how you feel, right? The one does seem a bit longer. And this is something called an illusion. And that's not the only illusion. There are many of them out there. So for instance, in the first image, all the horizontal lines are actually parallel, if you look at them closely. Yeah? And then the second image, if you're staring at it, you will notice that it's an image. It's not a GIF. It's not moving. But when you look away, it looks like it's kind of moving, right? And then the third one, I'm just going to have to take my word for it. I know it's difficult to accept. Square A and B are actually exactly the same color, right? Don't do it now, but afterwards you can Google color perception on Google Image, and you'll see this color perception illusion on Google Image, and you'll see this one. You can use a color picker to check that. Right. So the interesting thing is, I think all these images hopefully show us our interface with reality is not as reliable or robust as we like to think it is. And for me, my definition of VR is that VR is an illusion supported by technology. And through real-time tracking and computer graphics, VR actually taps into our interface with reality, which is not very reliable. And by replacing the world around us with virtual reality, with simulations, VR can actually trigger illusions that could challenge and reshape our belief in the world we live in. And that's kind of the reason why I think VR is a fantastic medium for health and healthcare, and I'll explain in a bit as well. So hopefully you all know kind of how this illusion works. As summarized by Professor Miles later back in 2009. When you put the VR headset on, three things happen. First, you see things in 3D stereo. You have two images, one for each eye. That's how we see 3D, right? And secondly, there's no escape. It's literally in your face, right? So like when you look around, you're still kind of trapped inside VR. Just like in a way, in real life, we're trapped in reality, okay? And thirdly, you have something called sensory motor contingency. It's actually something quite straightforward. So when in real life, I like to walk around when I give a talk, and as I move, my body detects that I'm moving through my ear, but I also see things slightly differently, even by small angles I'm moving, right? And my brain automatically integrates this kind of motor and visual perception, and that's how I develop my perception of reality. Right? And in virtual reality, thanks to real-time tracking and real-time graphics and the 6-degree of freedom tracking, that's really what you need in VR. These two things also holds true. As I move inside VR, the graphics display updates very quickly, and that's normally done within 10 milliseconds, right? That's why for VR headset, you need something like 90 hertz per second, right? And when that happened, my body really developed the illusion of what I perceive in VR is real, right? And I really react towards it. So it generates a strong illusion we're somewhere else rather than where we actually are, which might make our action in real life seems a bit ridiculous, but we just don't care anymore. And for me, what's really fascinating is not only this point of being somewhere else. I think what's really fascinating is with VR, we can actually be with somebody else. And that's obviously, very much the case during COVID. I think this is a party we had in VR Chat 2020 around Christmas time. It was a Christmas party, and we were doing karaoke inside VR Chat. I'm gonna just play this video. Can I have sound? You have to hear my colleagues' beautiful singing. Is the sound? Yeah. Can we increase the volume? I know this one's a bit low. And here I had a high five with my colleague. I think we all know have you all been in social VR before? Has anyone not tried social VR? Okay, it's quite a fascinating experience. I suggest you try it. Without trying it, you don't understand. It's an experience, right? If you never had roller coaster, you never know roller coaster feels, and it's kind of the same thing. Okay, so yeah, so during the pandemic, I spent quite a lot of time on inside social VR. We had our student welcome week in Outspace, which is unfortunately closed. It's actually really good for accessibility. I find it's always the easiest social VR to pick up. And then we had project meetings on Engage. We had international conference social session in Mozilla Hubs. We had our lab social in Rec Room, where you can actually go play paintball, and I'm really crap at it, and my students love how crap I am at it. But anyway, I also had actually enjoyed a concert, actually a few of them inside VR Chat. There's actually, during film festivals, you often see there are actually performances in VR Chat, and I recommend trying some of them. Most of them are not that great, but I think this is just the beginning of lots of really interesting experiences in this area. Right, so we all know that inside those kind of, the reason why I feel so real is that you can actually drive your avatar with your body language. In this case, she is driving her avatar through a Kinect, right? So hopefully soon enough we'll have a headset with a hand tracking capacity, so you can do better hand tracking, can drive our avatar that way as well, so don't need the controllers. But for now, normally use controllers, and you can even put some tracking devices on your feet, so you can drive, you can dance inside VR and do all sorts of interesting things. And I think yesterday, one of the speakers mentioned as well, soon enough we'll be able to have facial expression integrated in this system as well, because the technology, the hardware is already out there. So we will, and also it's a matter of time that we'll have avatars which looks exactly like ourselves inside social VR, having our facial expressions and really engage with each other that way. Right, so yeah, so in social VR, basically, we will feel that we're in a shared space with another person where we can gesture and use our gaze to socially engage. And this is actually quite important, and it's very interesting. It has interesting implications for health and healthcare, which is my area of interest. So we could imagine, now when I make appointment to see my doctor, sometimes they give me a call, sometimes they're in the Zoom session with me. So that's already happening, having computer-mediated therapy using technology remotely, right? So you can imagine actually in the near future, people actually have therapies inside social VR when we have social facial expressions and everything as well. And actually, those kind of therapy can make the whole process more anonymous, because lots of people experiencing mental health conditions, they don't want to actually be sort of, themselves in the therapy session because they don't want to talk about their mental health problem. They want to do it anonymously, and social VR will allow them to do that. And I think it's also an interesting case for the aging population. For instance, one of the problems with dementia is they suffer, like social deprivation is one of the things that make their dementia, makes their deterioration even worse. But you can imagine with social VR, they can actually experiencing some kind of authentic social interaction without having to be physically with someone if they have mobility issues. And also another area to highlight is actually a lot of the work in health and healthcare are done by scientists in drug discovery and everything. And one of the problems they have is they have problem even understanding each other's data, each other's research, is because the thing they do, although it's real, but it's also very abstract, right? So I see lots of like nice 2D images they try to draw, which takes lots of time to try to explain what they do, right? But just imagine you can actually do that inside virtual reality. You can have 3D objects where scientists can explain to each other about their scientific discovery. So I think social VR is going to be something that's going to be quite important in health and healthcare. But the problem, I think, is that at the moment there's still lots of different configurations technically, and I think the psychological impact of how these systems exactly work is not really well understood. So we conducted some study. Hopefully I'll summarize in the next 5 minutes or so, just very quickly. So one of the things we were looking at is, there are, for instance, in this image, you can see the two avatars actually look quite different. I was in a robot and my friend was in a kind of more cartoon-like human figure, right? So we want to kind of understand that. And also, so this is the kind of thing that would be considered, there's not much consistency because we're actually in very different form factors in that image as well. And some platform uses, what's going on? I don't want that. Okay. Anyway, and there are also platforms use avatars that's more realistic looking, and then platforms use avatars that are more cartoon-like looking, right? So we ran a couple of studies looking exactly at this. Okay, so this is the first study we've done. It was actually done in 2018-19 before the pandemic. So this is a 2x2 design. We had two factors. One is self-representation, right? So here we decided to represent one of the participants just with controllers, right? So the participant can be represented with either just a pair of controllers, because that's the only thing we render, or they are represented with a full body virtual character, because that's more computationally difficult to do, right? So we want to see this kind of setup. And the second factor is consistency. Whether it's consistent, the person you're interacting with have exactly the same body representation, or inconsistent, right? Which introduce inconsistency here. And the literature basically suggests inconsistency would lead to a lower rating in trust. So we just want to try to test that. So we had 4 conditions. Basically different combinations of these two factors, right? So you either have participants and the other person both represented by full body avatar, or the opposite C, none of them have a full body, just both controllers, or inconsistent conditions. Right. And we actually ran 2 studies. In the first study, we used a confederate. So the participant itself is always a participant, but the other is always a confederate who just there pretending to be a participant. And what we found is that when confederate, this is something we didn't expect at all. We found that we didn't find anything else, but what we found is when confederate did not have a body, which is condition C and D, participants actually trusted them more, and this was actually supported by a trust game. They invested more money, as well as a sort of slightly weaker result with the questionnaire data as well. So I can see the middle 2 box plot actually higher in terms of the money they receive as well as the score they receive, and that's basically C and D graph there. Okay, and that's very interesting. We didn't expect that at all. And we think, okay, maybe it's because in this case, the confederate is lying to the participant, right? They're pretending to be a participant where they're not. And by not rendering their body, they're actually better at hiding their true intention. Right? Maybe the confederate wasn't a great actor, so he was giving away too much. He wasn't being genuine when he was rendered a full body, and participant can detect that. Right? So that's kind of the explanation we came up with. So we ran another study where we had paired participants, which is a little more tricky to arrange because 2 of them have to both turn up, otherwise it won't work. And then this time we didn't find the same thing we found before, so it might mean that our theory is correct. But we also found what we wanted to find, which is that consistency actually played a role in trust. So the one that was in the consistent condition, which is condition A and C, they had a higher trust score of each other. So that's interesting. And then we ran another study. This study was with Microsoft Research in Cambridge, where we used the HoloLens. And then this study, we were testing different modalities of the avatars. So we created avatars for each participant based on their photos, but either photorealistic avatar or more cartoon-like avatar, right? And then we actually tested this setting it's a longitudinal study. So the study actually lasted 2 weeks, right? And so there are 14 participants. They were arranged into 6 groups. They're groups of either 2 or 3 people. And then for the first week, they would have 5 sessions, and they have another 5 sessions in the second week, right? But we have a randomized order where they either have a cartoon-like avatar in week 1, and then realistic avatar in week 2, or the other way. So we want to test which avatar is actually better. So the meeting, another sort of really interesting thing we had is that these are meetings they were going to have every day anyway. So we're just replacing their real life meetings rather than trying to give them a task to do, right? So but instead of having a meeting on Zoom, they were doing it remotely anyway. They had these meetings inside with the HoloLens in Microsoft, HoloLens 2. And I don't want to go into too much detail of the result of this, but I just want to show you something that's still under review, but I found this one was very interesting. So I asked participants to rate their own emotions after each session. And okay, this graph is slightly tricky to read. So the x-axis are the 5 weekly sessions, right? And then the ones, and so these are organized of the 4 emotions they're rating, and the one on the top, CR, is when they have cartoon-like avatar first, followed by realistic avatar, right? And then the yellow one is always cartoon-like avatar. The purple one is realistic avatar, okay? And then the lower one here is realistic and cartoon. So they had realistic avatar first. So they had the blue one, the purple one first, and then they have the yellow one for lower here. So the significant result we found were actually RC, when they had the realistic avatar first, right? And we had 2 significant results, is that first, when they had the realistic avatar first, over the first 5 days of the first week, their level of optimistic actually decreases, right? And then their level of stress actually increases, right? So I think if I were going to choose an avatar for my, everyday 10 minutes meetings, I think I'm definitely, with the current technical setup, I'm definitely gonna stick to the cartoon-like avatar. So a quick summary about those social VR studies. So the psychological impact would be very sensitive to small changes in the technical setup in social VR. But obviously, the ultimate goal is to try to represent human social signals in a complete way, which I don't think we'll ever be able to do that, but we can always try one feature at a time. And last but not least, consistency matters. So sometimes people will be joining in with different devices, right? And that means that they might actually, quite difficult to make their representations consistent, but that is the area we need to really work on, because that will help with trust. Okay, so going back to virtual social interaction, everything I talked about so far kind of is in this area, social VR, where we go into a place, we see somebody else, and this avatar, there's another person behind this avatar, okay? But very often, there's another form of virtual social interaction, which is human-agent interaction. We go into VR, or even with a flat screen, we see another virtual character, but there isn't a real human behind the virtual character. It's completely agent-based. It's computer algorithm-driven, right? And that's also kind of the other side of the spectrum. But I'm now going to show a video which belongs to none of these 2. So this is actually where I started VR. We created this in 2005. It was part of my master's thesis.
It's quite cheap. Thank you very much, though. You look very nice too.
Oh, thank you very much.
So here, I don't know how much you can hear the conversation, but basically she paid a compliment to him, and he was very happy to receive it. He was swinging his body left and right, and he's certainly having fun in this interaction. And he was enjoying it so much, he actually walked all the way back to the back wall of the cave-like system where we ran this study in order to be closer to her. But what he didn't realize is we actually programmed her to maintain an interpersonal distance away from him. So the more he kind of walked forward, the more she walked backward. So we also programmed gaze interaction and everything, a lot of it as well. So it was really great that this actually worked because we wanted to develop a scenario where we can help people who suffer from social anxiety to practice their interpersonal skills with a virtual character so that they can try to go through that sort of anxiety but in a controlled fashion, so they can practice and they can build confidence and until they're ready to embrace the real world. So that is, as I said, it actually doesn't belong to either this one or this one. The method we use, you can call it a hybrid method or wizard of the odds or humor in the loop. There are different names of it. But basically what we did is we recorded all the sort of animation. I mean, that video in particular was me hand animating her, but we recorded the voice with a professional actress. And then we sort of chop all the sort of clips, and then there's an experimenter in the room triggering all these events at the same time. And that's actually something quite common you see in the setting of training, in particular in health and healthcare, right? Because that's an area where it's high stake, and if there is no other way to provide training or treatment for patients, although it costs more than this method, but it's still very prevalent. And also if you collect enough data with this method, and then you can try to use the data to train an agent to probably make the selections automatically. So that's the hope. So lots of work I say up to this point actually uses this method. And I just want to now show you this video of how we actually use this method to train medical doctors in antibiotics prescription. So as you probably know that there is a sort of disaster emerging about the overuse of antibiotics. So if we all take antibiotics, whenever we feel unwell, then the problem is that we're going to develop antibacterial resistant bugs, which is superbugs. And if you don't do anything, I think by number here, this could kill 10 million people per year by 2050, right? So all medical doctors have the responsibility to safeguard antibiotics prescription, but sometimes they have very limited time. They are allocated to each patient, and some patient wouldn't take no for an answer, so they find this process actually quite tricky. So we decided to provide a VR scenario to train them with virtual patients.
Isn't it better that we give her some antibiotics to help her immune system?
Well, unfortunately, that's not how antibiotics work.
Reassuring as I can, I do not think that there is...
This is so unfair. It's going to ruin our holiday. I'm going to take this up with the local health authority. I think you are unfairly denying medicine to my mother.
Okay, I appreciate your concern. Thank you for your feedback.
My mother worked and paid national health insurance all her life. Now look at what's happening.
Sure, I mean, this has got in no way to do with your mother's health insurance payments.
They only means that old people are just invisible, not treated with respect by the NHS.
Thank you very much for sharing.
I suppose that this is all government cuts to the NHS.
I think now you all know how to get antibiotics from your doctors now, but please don't do it because it's really only useful when the doctor thinks you're medically, it's necessary for you. So we ran this study with 21 medical doctors. Actually, 12 of them are doctors, 9 of them are trainee doctors. Can you guess how many of them managed to resist towards the end? Out of the 21, shout out a number. About right, 4 of them managed to say no, and they're all from the 12 experienced doctors. So it's actually quite difficult. And then we actually brought this to the Whitehall to show the politicians in the UK. And I remember all the trainees when we were setting it up, and they were like, within a minute, they were like, okay, here's antibiotics, just go, I don't want to talk to you anymore. And then we had a politician who sat down, who went through this again, this with the characters, and he was just arguing. He's not even a medical doctor, but he's a politician. He just loves arguing. And his assistant was like next to him saying, you're late for your next meeting. I said, no, this is important, let me finish. So it does show that, these kind of argument, actually you become better at it through experience. And VR is a way to actually simulate that experience for you to practice this, right? Okay, so we also done some study in the area of child safeguarding. So that is an area that is really, because it's really interesting when I work with medical doctors, they run something called simulation. But by simulation, they actually meant practicing with real actors. There's nothing digital involved when they say the word simulation, right? But there's one tricky area they can't deal with in their own simulation, which is anything involving a minor, a child, right? And so they have this very tricky area of child safeguarding, right? So, and particularly not all sort of child safeguarding situation ended up in hospital in the way you'd expect. So when a child ended up at A&E, it's normally already too late to do anything about, right? Lots of the abuse is actually psychological. It doesn't really have sort of physical harm to the extent you would imagine. So it is medical doctors, like general practitioners in the GP, they're kind of family doctors, it's their responsibility to try to spot any problem as much as possible, because they are kind of the primary contact points of how families are connected to the society, right? But they often find it quite difficult, right? So no matter how much training you give them, you explain to them that's how it works, it might be difficult. So we developed a child abuse scenario with child safeguarding scenario with Professor Caroline Futterman, who is a consultant pediatrician. She's also the co-author of the Child Protection Practice Manual. So I'm going to play this kind of cue we developed together.
Surgery through the chest to replace the valve, and one is
that's open heart surgery.
Exactly.
Open me up.
Exactly.
So I probably should explain. So it's a father coming in with the child, and if you could see in the child abuse cue in the beginning, when they sat down, there was already something quite obvious that going on between the father and the child. But the consultation session actually focuses on the father who needs to decide between two quite intense operations, right? So we make it quite cognitively and emotionally demanding. I want to test if the medical doctors are still able to spot the problem between the father and the child, which we think was so obviously there, right?
And the other option is to try and replace the valve through with less invasive, as we call it, so through a catheter into the heart, which they don't have to cut you open. So that might be a better option.
Yeah. That's the red one, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
What's the worst that could happen if I do the open heart surgery?
Cool. Worst that could happen with any procedure like that is that worst can happen obviously is that you don't survive it, and open heart surgery.
That's why it's important.
Am I going to die if I go to open heart surgery?
I don't think any cardiologist would recommend it if they thought you were definitely going to die at all. If I could I need to wait. Dad, I don't need to do that.
For God's sake, we're having an important conversation here, you little shit. Talking about your come just cross your legs. This is far away important.
I don't mind if Tom wants to go to the loo and then you can bring him back.
Hello, mate. Trying to get on for an
Tom?
So he actually walked out of the room
Oh my
halfway,
God.
and then when he came back, he
Hi, Tom.
decided to leave. And then, and some of the doctors actually asked Tom some questions. But anyway, so let's jump to the measures. So the way we ran it with 63 medical doctors, and the way we evaluated is because they actually, the reason why we're running it in a cave-like system is because they needed to have notes on the computer, and we'd find it quite difficult to simulate, especially with, at the time, the resolution in VR headset are quite low. So we had to do it in a VR system, and they can see their laptop, and then after the father and son left, they then can type notes on the laptop, just as they do in a real consultation. And then we then give the notes to 10 how many independent raters? 10 independent raters, they're all trained in child protection and everything, so they can rate if the notes actually pointed out potential child abuse and also the process that's required to be taken, right? Because this is the point where you either put it in the notes and they get some attention, get dealt with, or you're missing a very important point where we can potentially save lives, right? And I think it's all obvious to you that the father wasn't the nicest father to the child, even for our untrained eye. So we also collected some, so that note result, the average of that 10 raters is our main dependent variable. And our independent variable, which is what we test before they come here, is the stress level, the doctor's self-reported stress level, and the Big Five personality. And here's the result. So this is the x-axis is the perceived stress level. The higher means they're more stressed. And the y-axis is the average score of the note they took. And as you can see, some of the doctors received a really low mark, right? Some even received 0 across all 10 raters. So this will be the doctor who didn't even mention there was a child in the room. Right? And it's highly unusual to take your young child for a discussion about, a really important surgery, and some doctors even forgot to mention it, right? So we can see there is a negative correlation between perceived stress and the quality of note, which means that the more stressed you are, the more likely your note is not that great. So it's probably good evidence to tell the government, look, if you want to actually save money in health and healthcare, you need to make sure the doctors are not stressed, because otherwise they will bring up the cost for later on, because you don't want a child to end up in a hospital or in the news. That's going to really cost you quite a bit. There are also correlations of their big 5, and these 3 are significant. So we found a positive correlation between agreeableness and extroversion to the quality of note. We found a negative correlation of neuroticism with the quality of note. So this probably is useful in terms of providing training for medical doctors. There are certain personality traits might need more help in this type of training. So this, again, is not something that's possible to actually get without virtual reality. And I think I'm going to skip this part and then just sort of play one last video. So there's something else, kind of follow-up study we've done, and I felt was actually not in any of these 3. It was actually just playing out a sort of social interaction in front of the participant. But this is a collaboration study with Zurich University of Applied Sciences. They're a bunch of researchers in social workers. So they want to try to help social workers to understand the impact of domestic abuse could have on the children, right? Because some of the domestic abuse we experience, family experience in everyday life is not physical. And when that is the case, the social workers often neglect the impact it would have in a child. So this is a study that has been just accepted as a poster to present at VR, and we're running a larger scale study. Does it work? Sorry. Here we go. So first they scanned the room, and then we have 2 actors. So I'm talking to you! We use real actors, and the performance and everything is really real. And then here's the embodiment stage. So you first inside VR, you are inside a child. You can play with those cubes, and you can put a hat on yourself to really establish that connection. And then the next moment, you are sitting next to a breakfast table. And
I've got to go soon. I'm going to be late.
Don't worry. The coffee's almost ready. It won't be long. We can start soon. So, Maya and Judith are meeting the children at the playground after school today.
You've got time for a coffee, but you don't have time to clean the flat. You can't even do that. I mean, look at the state of the place. It's a mess. And I'm supposed to give you money. For what? Don't make me do things I don't want to do.
I have to get the coffee.
Sit down! I'm talking to you!
So it's already quite stressful looking
Calm down, please. Leave me alone.
You want me to calm down, huh? Are you out of your mind? You're going to make me late. It's your fault if I lose my job.
Right, so yeah, it's even quite stressful to watch it on the screen, so you can imagine how it is to actually experience in VR. And we run a condition whether you're experiencing it inside the body of a child or from a third-person perspective. We want to see if embodiment here does add anything. Because I think it's proposed by the social worker group, they think that if they have a more kind of experience of the scenario, then they will remember it better next time when they deal with a similar situation. They will understand the psychological impact the child is suffering and make sure they actually spend some time on resources on, potentially actually helping the child. So I just want to say, wrap up the kind of virtual social interaction area I'm working on. I kind of started as a computer scientist, and I started working with psychologists and neuroscientists to really, have proper experimental method and really understand the brain mechanism behind social interaction, which I found really useful. But then after moving to Goldsmiths, I started working with medical doctors, but also started working with creatives and actors. And I feel a lot of things we do in this space, there is a lot we can collaborate and learn from those kind of people who does performance at their job, right? And lots of things they can't even express with language. You can really get them to, act it out for you. And I think that's a really, really interesting approach, and I always encourage you to take. Before I move on, I forgot to ask, so how many of you are actually from, say, a cognitive science background? And how many of you consider yourself like an engineer from computer science? And how about the rest of you? Or is it that's everybody? Okay, good, yeah. So I wanted to ask this question in the beginning, but anyway. So I just want to wrap up my talk in the next 5 minutes, or 3 minutes, I think. Yeah, I just want to show you this image. So the one on the left is the 2004 image of how computers sees us now, right? So for most computers, most digital interaction we have with just one eye, because you don't have stereo vision, and you have 2 ears because you have stereo audio, right? And then we're just like one finger to click the like button or make approaches, right? So this is how computers are seeing us. Most of the time when you're on your phone, this is how you interact with computers. And for them, for UX designers, that's who you are, right? And I appreciate yesterday we had someone explaining haptics, right? So this is the kind of representation of how much sort of sensory our brain is allocated to different body part of our body. Right? So this is kind of how we actually are, right? So this is the sensory homunculus, but actually there's a motor homunculus which looks very similar, big hands and big face. And why I think VR is a great space to work in is I feel that we're actually interacting with our full body, and we have our facial expression now integrated as well. If you look at this monster, it has big hands and big face, and that's exactly where we have the VR controllers and headset. That's the bit we're tracking, and we can render all sorts of video, audio, or even haptic output, right? So I think this could be the device that really help us to return to who we really are. Because I think if we don't do this now, digital technology is going to cause more kind of stress and mental health issues. And on that I conclude my talk. So I run a master's degree with my colleague, Professor Marco Gilles, and then our students are half of them come from technical background, the other half from the creative background, and I think it's really, really important for the future of XR to combine these two skill sets together. And this is kind of something they do within 2 weeks, studying with us to create some sort of silly VR, AR filters, but it's actually really fun. I love them. So this is my research lab. We have about 10 people working in sort of all sorts of different areas, including embodiment, AI, theater, and immersive experiences. And these are a bunch of fantastic collaborators we have the privilege to work with, and we also enjoy meeting each other in real life as well. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we have time for a couple of questions, so maybe if anyone has a question, then these two people will go and give you the microphone. And if you can repeat the question, just because for the online people.
Yeah.
Good morning. Thanks very much for a very nice talk. The studies that you've done in the VR space, how reproducible are they? Have you had the ability to run similar studies multiple times and compare the results, not within one study, but to get a feeling of what's anecdotal and what's more predictive?
That's a great question. So I'm going to repeat it. It's about the VR, the social VR study we have run. Is that something that's robust? Can we actually repeat it? And how much of it is anecdotal, and how much of them are, sorry, what did you say in the end?
I don't know, but I think robust, let's use that as, I mean, how solid are they, and how soft are they? That's, I guess, the real question.
Yeah, okay. So the answer is no, we're not able to repeat that. And I think I asked kind of a similar question yesterday to the second keynote. What's her name? I think it's USA. She's from Catherine. Yeah. So ask if she has run her study on Unity or she just used existing social VR platforms, because network development is really difficult, especially for a small research lab, right? But for one of the studies, so the second study was based on Microsoft Mesh, and that one depends on how Mesh evolves. We probably could repeat that. We're currently doing something with them, which is behind an NDA, and I can't talk about. And then for the in-lab one, we did repeat the study twice. But the first one was with a confederate, and the second one was with participants. And we were hoping to do a larger scale one, but then COVID happened. So although it's a social VR work, but it was actually set up, kind of local network, right? Because we don't have the capacity to have a proper. I mean, if we have the money to hire a network engineer, great, right? But we don't have that kind of money. So if I do get the money, I'd love to run more studies. But for now, I think it's just really, we're gonna have to do with whatever we can do. But I do think there is more studies, controlled studies, that's needed in this area. And as I said, in terms of robust, we did use both questionnaire as well as investment games, how much money you actually invest. And we use all sorts of questionnaire to check, how much what's the consistency and everything. And I think it's also important to probably run interviews as well. So not only questionnaires, but actually get people to talk about it. And I think there's so much we can learn from that.
Okay, thank you very much.
Oh, hi, I just have one question. In your experiment, I want to know the population size. For example, in the autistic children, you have normal people and the autistic individuals also. I want to know the population.
Yeah. So I don't remember the precise number, but I think it's in the region about 20 each group. Yeah, because you're right, with ASD, the recruitment is a real issue. But at the time, I was in a group that is specialized in running experiments with autism. And that wasn't children, by the way, it was actually adults. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Hi. With regard to your study on trust and the effect of embodiment on trust, I found it really interesting that you said that when there was nobody, there was more trust because the
Confederate is trying to lie.
Was giving away the lies of the Confederate. I thought this is a very kind of positive view on the avatar, right? Because it's interpreting the quality of the avatar of being able to give away these cues that the person is lying. But could it be the other way around, where in fact, like, the uncanniness of the avatar is kind of causing the distrust somehow?
I mean, I think if that's the case, then we would have somehow, to some extent, reproduced the result in our second study, but we didn't see that at all, right? It was just completely non-existent, right? So we kind of have to find an explanation. So whatever is happening is due to the fact that the first study, there's a Confederate, right? And we found that's probably the best way of explaining it, but if you come up with something else, please let us know. Yeah.
I think we can take one more question and then we go for it.
Yeah. Thank you for a very nice talk. My question is that, for example, for the study 2 that you described, the analysis was mainly based on the quantitative results that came from the rating that the participants put on that. But in the human-centered part, could we consider the results that you have mainly point to the technology aspects, or no, you could consider this result as both parts, technology aspects, the rating that participant gave to the technology, or the human factor results that they, I want to say your analysis could consider both technology and human-centered part, or no?
I think that's a great point. As I said, I'm an engineer, and this kind of learning to try to evaluate the system is already something I had to learn from psychologists, neuroscientists, and I found that really fascinating to actually find a way to evaluate a system I developed. This is new to lots of computer scientists, right? So, but I think this group, Pablo's group here, exactly, you guys are a lot more human-centered than the human-centered we thought we've been doing. So I would love to have conversations about, okay, how do we actually, so actually, I think yesterday, Heis mentioned that as well. I think in order for this area to progress, we need a kind of mixed evaluation model. We need quantitative and qualitative, and that's the bit I don't really know much about, right? But I think really in order to progress, we need to involve both. And I was talking to, because I'm now kind of more involved in health and healthcare, and I was talking to people who work in psychiatry, and I was like, hey, you can't just do questionnaires. You have to, have some, measures of how they move, because I'm all about quantitative. And then they were like, no, it's all about what they say. It doesn't matter what they do. It's really about this conversation you then have with them, because it's very subjective. It's on its own. It's a very subjective thing. And that made me think, yeah, that's right, right? But, I don't know much about it, and I would love to collaborate or learn from you guys.
Great, thank you so much.